Okay, so this is, for me, a special part of the program, which is obviously different than the keynoters from the Hill, and we also appreciate it because now we've got 5 of the Free State Foundation's distinguished members of the Foundation's Board of Academic Advisors. There are 19 in all. I'm not going to read their names. They're up on the website, and I'm really pleased that we have these 5 with us. And I want to say now, before I forget, that they've each agreed that they're going to produce. I'm going to limit their remarks to 5 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have time for some comments and exchange again. And I warned them I was going to do that, but they've all agreed to do papers as well that we're going to publish in a little book. Some of you remember a book we did a couple years ago that had some of these same scholars, but not all, and we're going to do another book. And in addition to those you see here, Jim Spada and Bruce Owen, 2 other members of the Foundation's Board of Academic Advisors, have also agreed that they're going to contribute papers. So look for that next year. Now, so before we get to that really serious part, I was told earlier that it's Christopher Yu's birthday today. Now, some of you I know were at the last FSF program in July. It was on universal service, USF at the time, you know, not the liveliest subject, but one that is timely, right? Although I said, trying to wake people up, because that was in the morning, I said, when you saw that USF sign down at the bottom of the National Press Club, you might have thought that was for unfulfilled sexual fantasies or something like that. But anyway, at that program, Jerry Ellig was a panelist, and we were talking about all the money involved in the USF program. And he's a great singer, so I had him sing from Evita, When the Money Keeps Rolling In. And he did a couple of bars. I don't know whether anyone can sing here, but why don't we sing, and I don't know the tune to Happy Anniversary, so we're going to forego that. Let's just sing Happy Birthday to Christopher Yu real quick, and then we'll get on. Happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you. I wasn't even thinking about that before, but I guess it was like happy birthday to you. We could have done. Okay, so we're going to take 5 minutes, and I'm just going to call up the scholars in the order that they're printed in your agenda book. And as I said before, I'm not going to do, you've got their bios here. I'm not going to spend time doing that other than just identifying their schools. First, and you can see the topics, but I'll announce those. First, we're going to hear from Michelle Connolly. And what I've asked them to do, by the way, is try and hopefully they've listened. I want to also try and look ahead over the next 5 years. I know you can't do that outside of the context of understanding where we are in some of the past, but I'm hoping we'll look ahead. So first, we're going to hear from Michelle Connolly from Duke University. That's because we're doing it alphabetically, not because she's from Duke High School. And she's going to speak about spectrum policy. Michelle?
So I'm here to talk a little bit about spectrum policy and what I'm hoping the FCC and Congress will allow the FCC to do going forward. Of course, this is an audience that's very well educated on this topic. But I want to bring a little bit of perspective from an economist's point of view. One of the important things to mention is how important information communications technology has been to productivity growth in the United States for the last 15 years. Over 50%, estimates are between 56 to 67% of U.S. labor productivity growth in the late 1990s is attributable to information communications technology. And from 2000 to 2006, 38% of labor productivity growth is attributable to information communications technologies. So it's very important to our economy. Since we are speaking at the Free State Foundation, I want to make a caveat that when we get to disaggregated studies, it is not the case that you impose broadband in any community in the U.S. and get the same labor productivity gains. The productivity gains that we are observing at the aggregate level are driven by specific types of industries and specific communities that essentially have traits which make them able to take advantage of the opportunities that broadband gives to them. So it's not a panacea for all problems in all regions of the country. But on the aggregate, it has played a very important role, and I foresee it continuing to play a very important role. We also know that there's exploding demand for spectrum use. In large part, it's a combination. One is we're having more advanced technology or more advanced devices, and these devices use more spectrum. So, as an example, your smartphone uses 24 times more spectrum than an old cell phone would have. A tablet would use 122 times more spectrum, and a laptop 515 times more data traffic on the spectrum than an old cell phone. So everything that where each individual is using up more and more, or has more traffic on the spectrum, and more people are purchasing these devices. So in terms of wireless subscribers, in #95 we had only 33.8 million subscribers. In 2010, it's 302.9, so over a tenfold increase. You have more people using it, using higher devices, so there's a great explosion in the demand for spectrum. One thing to also point out is it's amazing how quickly the number of wireless-only households is increasing. In only a few years ago, 2005, only 8.4% of households were wireless-only. In 2010, over 26% were. And this is important also when you consider low-income and minority households, because these are households who are more likely than white citizens or households to be using wireless to gain access to the internet, in part because sometimes they're using smart devices instead of a computer to access the internet. So that's an important component to put forward. Now, the proposal that's been put forth by Congress is to try and have a reverse auction, or two-sided auction. One is to ask the TV broadcasters in markets to bid on willingness to vacate from certain spectrum. And they are asked to bid on the choice of doing one of three things. One is to channel share within the same market. One would be to move to a different part of the spectrum. And three would be to discontinue over-the-air broadcasting. So a reverse auction, which would be the first side of the auction plan, would request broadcasters to ask how much money would they be willing, would the FCC need to give them to be willing to do one of these three actions. They can bid on all three of these different values, or they can bid on only one of these if they want. And how much they should bid should be based on the expected impact on their profits. One point to make out is in terms of direct profits is that over-the-air households are currently less than 10% of all television households in the United States. So that's becoming a much smaller segment of the TV audience. And I think that's important to point out in terms of the impacts on broadcaster profits. Then, if there is sufficient competition in those auctions, the auction is properly designed, we can expect what I call true valuations by the broadcasters who are making these bids. In order to have sufficient competition in the broadcast auctions, or in the spectrum auctions, though, it's important that there be a requirement that the FCC be allowed to repackage the spectrum after the auction process occurs. And this is true for two reasons, and it's actually quite intuitive. The FCC is trying to get 120 megahertz of contiguous spectrum. So if there's a line of channels and we get this channel here, 21, and then 35 and 52, we might have 122 megahertz going on, but not next to each other, and then it's not going to be useful for re-auctioning. So there must be an ability to repackage the spectrum into a continuous band. In order to do that, the FCC has to be able to move, say if there's one channel right in the middle that at no price is willing to move, the FCC has to be able to move them and compensate them for the cost of the move. By doing that, then in the auction process, you avoid having one channel that might know it's in the band that the FCC is trying to vacate, act as a holdout, and demand extraordinary sums to be willing to move. Secondly, let's suppose this is the band that the FCC is trying to move out of the whole range. If we can't relocate someone who's in this spectrum, then another channel, say channel 14, becomes irrelevant to the auction mechanism. But if there's repackaging possible and relocation possible, then channel 14 can bid to be willing to move or say vacate, and then a channel here that's in the band that might not wish to terminate broadcasting or might not wish to channel share could be moved to the channel 14 area. And so that means that now all of the broadcasters within the same market become relevant competitors in the bid process. And this helps to get true valuations on the bids and helps to lower the bid values within a market. Once the FCC is able to choose the winning bids, they get the spectrum, they're able to resell. The current administration is talking about it likely going to wireless broadband, but it's an auction. Anyone can buy it. Whoever has greatest value for that usage can bid and win. Last point I wanted to make is a point that I made before Congress when they were considering this, is the importance that Congress not try to micromanage the auction by imposing conditions, particularly conditions on what type of person can win the auction or things like that. This is the beauty of the auction, and the reason why this is such an important mechanism is that the auction is market driven, and it will help decide who will be able to make best use of the spectrum. And any conditions of the type that have been imposed before on who might be the right person to win is going to greatly hinder the effectiveness of the process.
Okay, well, thank you, Michelle. Our next speaker is Ellen Goodman. Ellen is at Rutgers School of Law in Camden, and she's going to speak about public media. And I'm really happy all of our scholars are here, of course, but I'm especially happy that Ellen is here because she may surprise me, but I think, knowing some of her views, I probably agree with them less than anyone up here, but nevertheless, that's why I value her being here. I mean, one of the things we value is being able to listen and learn and discuss. And so, Ellen, I'm glad you're here. You've got 5 minutes.
This is the perfect distance for my eyes. Good afternoon. When Randy asked me to join this advisory board, I told him, but Randy, you know I'm pretty liberal, right? And he said, yes, I know, that's why I called you. We want multiple perspectives. I thought that was a wonderful and increasingly rare exhibit of intellectual openness, but it didn't surprise me. Free State's contributions to the telecom and media policy discussions, whether they come from Randy or Seth Cooper, Debbie Tate, or from Donna Gregg, have been uniformly well-reasoned and thoughtful, and though I sometimes reach different policy conclusions, I'm always enlightened by their analysis. So it's in the spirit of this intellectual openness that Randy asked me to say a few words about the need to rethink and remake public service media policy. By public service media, I refer generally to nonprofit media infrastructure and content networks that receive some kind of public subsidy, whether that's in the form of tax relief, a federal appropriation, a spectrum set aside, or some other regulatory intervention. And what I propose that we need, in short, are 2 things. One, better and more refined framework for what kinds of services are needed in the digital age. And secondly, an overhaul of the Public Broadcasting Act that frees the services both from legacy broadcast distribution platforms and from legacy entitlement holders. The historical justification for public service media is rooted in the concept of market failure, a concept that the Foundation has worked hard to define and cabin. Long before the Public Broadcasting Act was passed in 1967, the FCC had set aside TV and radio channels for non-commercial use. The idea was that commercial broadcasters were never going to produce certain kinds of public goods. Educational programming was the paradigmatic example. On the infrastructure side, policymakers recognized that the market would not provide all communities, especially rural ones, with homegrown broadcast services. So the non-commercial set-asides encouraged land-grant universities and other community institutions to provide that service. In the decades since, with advances in technology, we've lost sight of where the market failures are on both the content and infrastructure sides, and what kinds of policy interventions are necessary to supplement what is, for the most part, a robust information market. Public media, especially public broadcasting, have been beset by their own market dynamics and market failures. They've come to produce for the relatively small population segments that provide most of their financial support. Sometimes this results in filling market gaps, but not always, and not all of them. In some cases, the current structure has produced unique service to rural areas, but it's also produced duplicative service in the big metropolitan areas. The assaults on and defenses of All Things Considered and Big Bird as representative of public media, although they make for good political drama, really miss the point. There is some urgency to the need to rethink public media. We've just talked about spectrum policy. As we look forward to the television spectrum going up for auction sometime this decade, it's important to remember that 20% of this spectrum is in the hands of non-commercial licensees. This spectrum was set aside, like parkland, for a public purpose. Whether those spectrum assets produce windfalls for lucky nonprofits or are redeployed for other public purposes should be of interest to both liberals and conservatives. My second point is that the structure of public media that we have, including public broadcasting, cable peg channels, the satellite set-aside for non-commercial channels, etc., is all badly out of date. We can focus just on the Public Broadcasting Act to see that the law privileges a transmission technology, broadcasting, that is moving to the margins. And it privileges a set of institutions, legacy broadcasters, that may not be in the best position to supplement market goods and services. The law needs a redo. You've heard this before in communications policy discussions. Laws constructed around legacy services simply cannot reflect digital realities. That's certainly true in the public service media arena. What usually follows from these kinds of observations is a radical proposal for reform. And I do have my own ideas about radical reform in this space. But I want to close with a fundamentally conservative point, with a nod to the father of Anglo-American conservatism, Edmund Burke. In the late 18th century, Burke feared that progressive politics would undermine the respected social and political institutions that foster peace and prosperity. In other words, he valued the cultural capital that took generations of people living in civilized societies to develop through stable institutions. Whatever one thinks about particular public service media initiatives, there can be no doubt that public media institutions, some local, some national, embody a great deal of cultural capital in a space that lies outside of both the state and the market. Polls consistently show that Americans across all demographics respect certain of these institutions more, sometimes by a factor of 2 or 3, than other institutions, including courts, legislatures, businesses, and so on. Any Burkean would respect and want to preserve this kind of cultural capital. At the same time, any responsible 21st century policymaker should want to invest it more wisely.
I think you in the audience can see why I value having Ellen on our board and your contributions, and look forward to your paper in the book. And also I'm glad you mentioned Edmund Burke, because we can now have invoked Hayek, Schumpeter, and Burke, and I don't know that there are too many icons left to hit, but I appreciate that. Okay, now we're going to move right on to Daniel Lyons. Daniel's our newest advisory board member, he and Michelle, and he's at Boston College Law School, and he's already contributed several pieces to FSF that we've published, and today, and those have tended to be in the net neutrality area and talking about new types of paradigms for common carriage, but today he's going to be speaking about USF reform, a timely topic, of course. Daniel.
First of all, I want to say congratulations on my own to the Free State Foundation for reaching the 5-year mark. And more importantly, for the amazingly high level of success you've achieved in the 5 years. The foundation has quickly risen to be one of the premier voices for market-driven policies in the telecom industry at a time when the industry is itself becoming increasingly competitive. So that demand for that kind of voice is really important. So it's an institution with which I'm proud to be affiliated. I want to talk today about Federal Universal Service Program reform. It's an issue that's sort of been on and off the FCC's agenda for about a decade now, but one that the agency's seen a lot of increasing interest in over the past year. So since 2001, the USF surcharge, rural surcharge to fund the federal USF program has gone from 6% to just over 15%. It's a charge that costs consumers about $8 billion annually. Now, so far, consumers don't seem to be paying a lot of attention to this rise, and I think perhaps part of the reason is that the public has always sort of seen the value of programs like Lifeline and Link Up that are making sure that impoverished people have access to basic telecommunications service. Right? And they'd be shocked, I think, to learn that less than half of your USF dollars actually go to that noteworthy program. And in fact, the single largest destination for USF dollars, $4.3 billion last year, or just about half of all the money they took in, it goes to the high cost fund, which gives money directly to carriers to defray the costs of, or some say to have the bottom line, phone companies in rural markets and other high cost markets. The high cost fund is precisely, I think, the sort of corporate welfare program that President Wildman railed against at times in more general language. And I think it would drive the Wall Street guys nuts if they sort of HCF is largely a legacy of the cross-subsidies that the Bell system had set up when it was a monopoly, right? The goal was to, 2 generations ago, to keep the cost of residential telephone service artificially low by drawing in money from other services, especially in rural areas where there are fewer customers on each line, and therefore the cost per customer is a lot higher. So when Bell broke up, the local carriers succeeded in creating the high cost fund as one of many ways to try to maintain these cross subsidies. It's as if, to steal a line, we're sort of still in the Great Depression and Ma and Pa on the farm would lose their phones unless the government chipped in and helped out, right? And so this ongoing sort of bailout of sorts, an annual bailout, that is one way to phrase it, has predictably inefficient results. First of all, it's very overbroad. And certainly there's some high-cost fund aid that's going to impoverish rural communities. But a lot of it's going to areas that, while they're high cost, they're not at any particular risk of falling off the network if they had to pay full freight. I'm talking about places like Sun Valley, Idaho, Vail, Colorado, Ted Turner's Ranch up in Montana, right? These are places that shouldn't be receiving high-cost fund money. In those situations, a high-cost fund is merely facilitating a lifestyle choice, right? It's making it easier for people to get away from the big city by forcing consumers to pick up part of the cost of doing so. Secondly, the high-cost fund tends to be a very inefficient investment. The FCC has admitted itself that the fund produces very poor incentives to invest or operate efficiently. For example, rate of return carriers receive funding based largely on the amount by which their costs exceed national benchmarks, which creates an obvious incentive to overinvest in order to drive up those costs and get a greater handout. And then finally, it's marked by wasteful spending. A 2006 government audit showed that almost $1 billion, a quarter of the entire high-cost fund, went to impermissible services. Another study has shown that about 60% of the high-cost money that's going to local exchange carriers is covering general administrative costs, not line build-out and line maintenance, which is the idea behind a universal service program, getting the lines out. And that doesn't even get into the administrative issues with a taxing scheme that's where the rate is being set and money is being spent not by Congress or even by an agency, but by USAC, a sort of delegate of the agency. So none of this is really news to the industry, or to Congress, or to the FCC. And to the FCC's credit, it promulgated rules last February to start to fix the problem. And that's part of what we were talking about at the last conference, I understand. But the agency's goal so far has been to take the high-cost fund and transition it to a Connect America fund, something that's dedicated to achieving universal broadband penetration. Now, there's much to like in the proposed rules, and I think it's pretty clear that broadband universal service is coming, and if done right, that's a good thing. But as any student of the FCC knows, the devil's in the details, right? And the details of a long-term plan are yet to be determined. So what I'm really concerned with is that simply transitioning the high-cost fund from a telephone fund to a broadband fund risks replicating many of these old problems and carrying them forward another generation to the next technology. So with that concern in mind, I'd offer a couple of guiding principles that I think should be relatively uncontroversial when mandating the transition. First of all, the primary, indeed the overarching goal, I think, should be to target aid to those consumers who generally cannot afford broadband, and to give these consumers assistance directly rather than through carriers as proxies. You know, something like a telecom food stamp program that gives consumers choice that they can take from carrier to carrier and minimize the distortions that come with USAC picking winners and losers. And secondly, I think that means gradually but firmly shuttering the high-cost fund. The first step, I think, has to be stopping the bleeding, putting a hard cap on the $4.3 billion that we're already spending, and then lowering that cap over time so we can phase out aid to carriers and redeploy that money where it's most useful, either to consumers who need it or back to the general public for whom it's being taken.
I'll just say in my own 30 seconds that since this issue is before the commission now, and I've done a lot of writing about it, and others at the Free State Foundation, and Debbie Tate, former Commissioner Tate as well. We, you know, to be really clear about it, I really agree that the USF program needs to be radically overhauled. The fund needs to be capped. There ought to be a sunset in the future. I don't think we need a new entitlement. But we've also said, or I've said, we all speak individually, but I think Mr. Tate feels this way, that doesn't mean there shouldn't be a robust lifeline program to address those people that need it, and that's really the way to make sure that we have universal service in an efficient way. Okay, enough said about that. Now, our last two speakers are original members of the advisory board, and next we're going to hear from Stephen Wildman, and he, of course, is at Michigan State, and he's going to speak about media policy. Just 5 minutes, Steve.
Okay, I think I'll follow Michelle and set the patterns have already been the lawyers stand and economists sit. And we'll see what Christopher holds that. I want to mention, I'm the second economist mentioned the program today that's actually not born in Austria. Right? And last, I want to thank Randy, one, for having me here and the opportunity to talk to an interesting crowd and meet some interesting people, but also for pointing out the dirty little secret of academics earlier on, that those who find it comfortable to adhere to high ethical strictures go into politics, and those who don't find safe haven in universities. So now you know where I'm coming from. And what I want to talk about is the way that the technological underpinnings of media industry are changing, what that means for law and regulation and policy in general that governs the media. Today, most of us are still watching television over the air, a few of us, maybe 10%, or getting it through cable, or getting it through satellite providers. That's certainly what I had last night in my hotel room. But all of these carriers and all the content providers that are providing programming are actually putting the same stuff on servers, and it's available on the internet. And if you look closely, a year ago there was a lot of discussion about over-the-top video, streaming stuff directly from the internet into your television set. That's already passé. It's certainly coming. But if you have an iPad, such as we have next to me, or an iPhone, like I have in my pocket, or a Droid, or so forth, you're carrying around a receiver with you. And the real future, and I think this is happening faster than most people realize, is moving towards server-based distribution, or the current term for that is cloud computing. And what that means is that physical infrastructure, which has always been the basis for identifying regulated entities in the U.S., the broadcasters, the cable companies, the people that have satellites and download programming, those facilities no longer identify the gatekeepers for the critical content, or they won't send it. It's people that reside in the cloud. It's your Netflix, it's your Hulu, it's your Facebook, and so forth, and entities we don't even know yet. It's YouTube. These become critical gatekeepers. But because they are now exist in cyberspace, we don't have either the law or the regulatory structure for actually imposing regulations that mean anything, and we don't even know what it would mean to do so, because they can vanish in an instant, right? You put restrictions on one person and somebody else crops up to do the same thing. How do you define the service when it's changing so rapidly? And it's important to realize that whereas in the old technology it was based on sending stuff down costly spectrum-using channels, whether enclosed in fiber or whether over the air, and so it's the marginal cost of adding spectrum capacity, really, in one way or the other, the limited amount you have, the cost of server capacity is extremely cheap. And so the incentive there is to proliferate content rather than to cull and restrict. And so notions of scarcity in terms of getting voices out there and so forth no longer exists in the same way it used to. Something that's an underpinning of current policy, but that's going to go away. The second point is that the receivers are all smart devices. Your television set will soon be smart, your iPad, your iPhone, your personal computer. And so now you're an active participant in the process of receiving content. You can create content so that the means of content production have been democratized in a way that was just totally unimaginable when our current regulatory system first evolved. Now that means that nobody is literally in the sense of having access to the means of communication is really denied anymore. It's a different question as to whether everybody can be heard, but we no longer have the old vehicles for ensuring that people can be heard, and how we would force people to be heard in this endless sea of billions of different messages becomes another question. So what do I draw from this? One is the underpinnings of the system that's rapidly fading are disappearing. Right? We're sort of left with legacy regulations and laws for legacy technology that will be irrelevant fairly shortly. Second is that we're too early into this to have a good sense of what it's going to look like. We're just starting to see the outlines, and maybe those outlines will be different 5 years from now too. And it's not a good time to start getting to be issuing prophylactic regulations, trying to constrain and channel things in a direction we want. One, we don't understand the forces well enough. We probably can't control them if we did, and we have no idea whether things will go in a better direction than in a worse direction. I think one thing that will be clear is that regulatory policy will no longer be prescriptive in the sense of imposing service obligations on people, because it's if we impose it on Facebook, whatever we impose, content's going to be lost in the billions of bits that are out there anyway. It doesn't mean anything, and you can't keep people off regardless. Anybody can put anything they want on YouTube, for example. And so I think what we'll end up with is more rules of the road. We have issues that didn't used to be part of media policy, like privacy, access to personal data, surveillance, and so forth. Those now are inextricably linked together with media policy. And it's going to be a really interesting time for people like to study this like me in the years going forward.
Okay, now, last but not least, we have our birthday celebrant, Professor Christopher Yu from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. When Christopher told me what he was going to speak about, I sort of knew it wasn't USF. It probably wasn't, media policy. I wasn't sure exactly what it was, so I just said internet regulatory policy on the program. Christopher.
Well, thank you, Randy. And it's a pleasure to be back here at the Free State Foundation again. I've been here seeing so many familiar faces from previous events. It's a privilege to be here. it's a testament to what I think of Randy, that even on my birthday and somewhat against my wife's best wishes, I'm here. So anyway, although I do have one bone to pick with Randy, and it was prompted by a comment that Steve made to me just before it began. He said, he's delighted to have me here because he's not last. And I made a point in front of the last Free State Foundation point, which is no privatization regime is unbiased, even first come, first served. And I can guarantee you, I said this last time, and Randy did promise me I'd go first. We do reverse alphabetical next time we spoke, and it just hadn't happened. But it gives me a chance to make this other point once again. And more to the point, I actually kind of like going last, so it suits me just fine. So what's interesting is I am talking about internet policy, and I'm going to use as a starting point, I have a book coming out in the AEI press in January. And one of the core points of the book is that policy debates are largely framed by the way the internet existed in 1995, when the internet first became a mass market phenomenon. And at the time, it was a fairly narrow group of users sending email and web browsing through a PC connected to a telephone line, and the network was governed by a fairly narrow set of business relationships in terms of topology and in terms of pricing. All those things are now false. We have a huge explosion of the total number of users, but more importantly, the heterogeneity of users, sending streaming media and other applications that are much more demanding in terms of what they demand from the ask of the network, through end-user devices that are much more varied and much more different in terms of the way they operate, in terms of operating systems, and technologies that are radically different, and through a much, much richer set of business relationships, both in terms of the players, but also how they're priced and how they connect to one another. And in many ways, I think that the natural assumption would be, from someone who looks at it as, if everyone wanted the same thing from the network, we'd use on one network optimized for what everyone wants. As what people want differs, and as what the cost of delivering it in different ways differs, we expect the network to change in response. And the natural thing that companies should do to meet varied demand is to start making more varied offerings. And we should start to see heterogeneity in the network. And the shorthand version I have for saying this is, the days of the one-size-fits-all internet are probably over. Now, that's the focus of the book, but the point I would like to make is, what's the primary counter-argument? Well, you see this in the FCC open internet order. As a friend, I remember we talked about this in February. We had a topic of what comes after network neutrality, and the answer is more network neutrality, but that's a different matter. They say there is one internet. And they say that there is a value to all this being connected to one, and the bigger the better. And Steve and I were chatting over lunch, if you look at the economic models, they sort of posit these infinite returns to scale and market size. Bigger is better. And what that struck me is that that's powerfully wrong. There's some discussion in the press now about people getting frustrated with Facebook because it's too big. It's become unmanageable, and there's a congestion and an information cost aspect where people are seeking smaller, more targeted networks. But also, it strikes me that there's a value side to this in terms of the end users. There are actually a huge number of websites that have no value to me whatsoever. I speak a number of languages, but it is finite, and there's a vast number of these things, Google Translator notwithstanding, that aren't particularly valuable to me. But more to the point, it's not just things that are no value, things have differential value to me. If you look at the way I use the internet, I connect to two places more than anything else. My email server and I remote desktop access to my office. I would willingly pay the sacrifice worse connections to the rest of the internet for a lot better connections to those. And in fact, I'd probably beyond that go disproportionately to maybe a half a dozen other websites. And we see this in phone calling. The number of people the average phone caller calls more than once a month is apparently 6. And in fact, we have radical heterogeneity in value of the different locations. So what this suggests is, the way, if what we want varies based on location, we should see it would be good for consumers, it would be good economically, and what people want is to have a network that allows us to do different things with it, that's customized to what we want. Not just in terms of services, but where we can go. And so I think that there's a lot of consequences. What happens is one solution is private networking. If you really want a rocket connection, I could do that. That's an exit option that's rarely talked about in the debate because we assume it's this one big public network. There are people who exit. But what's coming up now is that's actually fairly, it raises some scale economies. It's much better if I can share the connection and share the capacity with other things. It lowers the cost dramatically. So the question to me is, we're going to be, the analysis I'm spitting out suggests that we should see a world in which we see these kinds of connections where you can get prioritized services to the place you want by reserving part of the bandwidth for doing that, or being able to set up unique relationships that will allow me to connect my email server in my office better. And the concern I have, and this can be fleshed out in the contribution I'll make to the book, is that some of the terms of the debate when we say there's one internet and we must be able to connect to all locations equally, I think is motivated by a very laudable vision, but is actually threatening real value to consumers and end users, because that doesn't reflect the way we really use the internet. In fact, we use it in very different ways, and as that becomes more and more different, we should expect more and more customized offerings, and that's a good thing, not a bad one.
Okay, thank you, Christopher. You can see why I value the contribution of Christopher and all of our academic scholars so much. So, we've got time, I think, for a couple of questions. Kathy, I'm going to need you to make sure someone's looking out for Congressman Stearns. And while I just reminded me when I mentioned Kathy's name, Kathy's our events coordinator at the Free State Foundation, Kathy Baker. So could you give her a round of applause? And then finally, just quickly, my wife Lori is here, and I don't think we've ever ordered a salad dressing or picked out a variety of chicken without Lori's input here, and a whole bunch of, I'm being silly, but she does a lot of other things for the Free State Foundation as well, and every day, day on, day out, and on the weekends too. So Lori, thank you for that. Okay, I think I saw Dan. Did you raise your hand? Dan Redder has a question. Would you go over just a minute to Dan? And, all right, go ahead.
All right.
Go ahead.
Question for Ms. Connolly on the incentive auctions.
And just announce, for the record, we're getting everyone's name.
Harris from the Sunfire Group, Alexander. In your discussion of the incentive auctions, you didn't really deal with the price that the broadcasters would get for auctioning their spectrum. And the price obviously is key in determining the supply of spectrum available. It's also key in determining the amount of income the government will get from the auction, since the overall revenue is determined by the intersection of demand and supply curve. If you raise the price that the broadcasters get, you increase the supply, you decrease the revenue to the government, and vice versa. So it's kind of an interesting optimization problem. How's it going to be dealt with in the auctions? Have they figured out a way to do that within a price range to maximize the benefits of both sides?
Yes, well, so the final auction design still needs to be created, but there is capacity for, so basically, the broadcasters put in a bid, and the winning bid will be determined through the auction process. But it will not be where supply intersects demand. Where supply exactly intersects demand, then there would be no revenue. And the goal is not to get all the broadcasters out. The goal is to achieve a certain amount of contiguous spectrum. They're shooting for about 120 megahertz in each market. So when they see the bids that are submitted by the broadcasters, you can map out a supply curve. And simultaneously, they have bids on the buy side that can map out the demand curve. And from that, they can determine essentially what the winning bid should be on the broadcaster side and what the winning bid should be on the purchasing side in order to get just the right amount of spectrum that they're trying to get. And then that also leads to positive revenues for the government. So everything you're saying is exactly right, and that's the question of having a well-designed auction where the FCC is able to actually map these things out before the winning bids are determined. This can happen instantaneously if it's well enough done, but there's a process for doing that.
I think Congressman Stearns, I saw him poke his head in, but while she's getting him in, Dan, you asked a quick question.
Quick question for Steve and maybe Ellen. I think everybody agrees that the media landscape is changing a lot. We're coming into an election season. This afternoon, we've heard even some fairly partisan items. Perhaps, do you think that the Section 315 laws that still apply to commercial and non-commercial broadcasters, particularly commercial broadcasters, should be enforced in the year 2012, or does the dissipation of their power mean that we should just forget about it because we're not capturing enough of the speech in the community now?
Well, actually, you're referring to the laws that govern the pricing of advertising time?
Right, but not only the pricing, the lowest unit charge, but also the right to buy time if you sell it to one party.
Actually, if you look at sort of a game theoretic analysis of that design, it turns out that politicians probably pay more for access to airwaves, given the restrictions, than they would otherwise. That if I'm being told that if I lower the price for one person, I have to lower it to everybody, I'm going to raise it for everybody and keep it up. Right? So it was a bad design to begin with. It was good for broadcasters, it was good for everybody to sold time to politicians, and it's something that should have been eliminated in any case. Now I think if we're going to be literally fair about this stuff, then we have to start looking at the power of internet-based media as well. The argument could be made that the use of the internet to generate donations and fundraising and so forth had a much bigger impact on the last presidential election than anything that was done in commercial broadcast media. And so if we're going to retain these kinds of things, it should be comprehensive and encompass all media. Frankly, I don't know how you're going to do it, because the media have some very, very different characteristics.
Okay, well, actually, apparently, the person that opened the door wasn't Stearns. That's what happens when you don't have your glasses on. So if we have another question or comment, we can take that. And also, if any of you guys have any questions or comments of the others, or just want to say something else, you can do that, because we're going to wait until he comes and then start right in. Does anyone else have a question? Or sir, you could even follow up. I thought I saw Congressman Stearns here, but was there something else you wanted to say?
No, that's a great explanation. It's just that I've got the impression from your answer that these issues are not going to be raised once we come. We have a long way to go before the conflict will be pulled off.
So you can finish now. That is truly, I do see Stearns even without my glasses. So, but Michelle, you just answer quickly, and then we'll get Congressman Stearns on.
So, for example, in 1993, when the FCC was first given authority to do auctions, they spent a year developing auction design, and they hired academics and they ran experiments in order to come up with a simultaneous multi-round package bidding that we have now and things like that. And there's full anticipation that the same thing will be done. So once it receives authority, then it's going to go forward with the analysis of how to structure the auction properly. So you're correct, it's not a done deal yet, but it can't really start until it has the authority to do so.
How long do you think it would take to design it?
I think it would take at least a year, potentially two.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. I want you to all join me once again in thanking these.